Welcome, everyone. We're just letting some people in, so welcome. Feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and where you're calling in from. My name is Julie Leach, Senior Manager of Campaigns and Communications at TAF. Thank you for joining us today for the 2024 edition of the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area Carbon Emissions Inventory. And I can see a lot of people joining the call. Hello, welcome. I'd like to start by acknowledging the land on which many of us are gathering virtually, referred to by settlers as the Greater Toronto and Hamilton Area. Indigenous people have lived here for thousands of years, including the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, Erie, Neutral, Anishinaabe, Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. So again, please feel free to introduce yourself if you'd like in the chat, where you're calling from, and you can use the chat for general comments. If you do have questions for our presenters today, please use the Q&A function at any time. We're going to hold those for the panel discussion at the end, and we have a good amount of time for that. And just a note, we'll share the slides and recording of this webinar by email to everyone who registered. And now for what we're all here for, the carbon emissions inventory. This edition reflects 2024 data. It's going to unpack the sources of emissions by sector, by region, and municipality, and it analyzes the trends and progress against climate targets and plans. If you've already peeked inside the report launched today at carbon.taf.ca, I think we have that in the chat, you'll know already that emissions are up again, and this is now a trend. They're up for the fourth year in a row. We were trending down after the coal phase out. They dipped during the pandemic. But despite efforts from many of us on this call, we are just not meeting, we are not on track to targets. Affordability and the economy are dominating public priorities right now. We saw that reflected in the federal budget earlier this month. We've seen it in recent climate policy rollbacks. And that's why it's more important than ever to show how climate action is working, showing how it is about improving affordability for regular people. Climate action is economic action. The results and recommendations we want to share with you today highlight some bright spots, progress, and proven solutions. The message is clear. We know what to do. We know it works and delivers results. It's just not happening at the pace and scale needed. So it's time to double down on these known solutions. More about that during our policy recommendations and discussion. So without further ado, I will introduce TAF and my colleagues. About us, the Atmospheric Fund, or TAF, is a nonprofit agency. We invest in low carbon solutions in the Greater Toronto and Hamilton area and help bring them to scale. It's my pleasure to introduce the report authors. So from our research and innovation team at TAF, we have Ekaterina Zakova, Director, Patrick Ronan, Analyst, and Mariam Shakaris-Fard, Manager. And we also have Brian Purcell, Vice President of Policy and Programs, to share our policy recommendations today. So Ekaterina is going to kick us off with an overview of the results. Ekaterina.
Thanks, Julie. Before we get into the numbers, I wanted to provide a bit of context to our inventory work. We started tracking and reporting on carbon emissions across the region back in 2015. And really the purpose there was to help understand where we should focus our attention as an organization. But we also wanted to make sure we're sharing that information with all levels of government and practitioners across the GTHA. As Julie mentioned, we track emissions across 5 key sectors. That's buildings, transportation, industry, waste, and agriculture, and across the 6 regions in the GTHA. And we also go down to individual city levels within these regions. Like most inventories, ours includes scope 1 and 2 emissions, but in a number of places and where we can get good data, we also report on scope 3 emissions. So things like embodied carbon of major building materials, aviation emissions, fugitive methane, and so forth. We aim to publish our inventory with a 1-year lag, usually in November, and that's to make sure that we get information out to the right stakeholders and decision makers as quickly as possible. Next slide. So where are we at in 2024? Well, emissions increased by 1% and we reached 54.7 million tons across the GTHA. It's another year where this increase is in contrast with the 11% annual decrease we need to hit across the region to make sure we reach future targets. Total emissions increased across most sectors, with the exception of the industrial sector. And emissions also increased in almost all regions, except for a small decrease in Peel. What's driving these increases in total emissions is largely the transportation sector, so that's personal vehicle use, as well as the building sector, specifically the increased amount of natural gas generation driving up the carbon intensity of the electricity grid. Next slide. You can see the spread of emissions across the region on this map. We've shown total emissions, so not adjusted for population. Total emissions in each region increased anywhere from about 0.8% in Hamilton to almost 5% in Halton. And the latter specifically had a big jump because of higher natural gas consumption used in industrial buildings. For emissions normalized by population, per capita, the results decreased by about 3% across the region. And we saw decreases in 5 of the 6 regions. Where we did see a small increase in per capita emissions was in Halton, once again, because of building emissions going up about 2.5%. Next slide. Here we're going one layer deeper. It's a spread of emissions at a more granular city level. And this chart, along with a couple others, are also available on our website in downloadable form. Now here we split out building emissions in 2 parts. We have natural gas emissions as well as electricity emissions. And maybe highlighting a couple of observations across the region. In Durham, transportation was the largest source of emissions, especially in some of the lower density areas where there is a larger reliance on personal vehicle use. We saw natural gas emissions actually decreased in Ajax and Clarington pretty significantly, 6 to 7%. Halton, building emissions are up, largely because of industrial buildings. Building emissions also represent the larger source in Burlington and Oakville. Now, one interesting thing about transit ridership, Milton Transit specifically had the highest growth in transit ridership across the region. There was a 73% jump compared to 2023, which was really exciting to see. Toronto and Hamilton saw fairly sizable decreases in natural gas use in both residential and commercial buildings, and that's starting to indicate that building retrofits are starting to make an impact. Peel had a bit of a spread. Building emissions were the highest contributors in some municipalities like Mississauga, while transportation was the largest in Brampton and Caledon. And York region was interesting, and they saw a bit of a shift. Transportation is now the primary source of emissions across most of the municipalities there. Now, if you're city staff and you see a blank spot next to your municipality, there's no bar graph, that means that we need your help in getting natural gas data specifically. So please get in touch with one of us after the webinar. Next slide. We like to include this graph here to zoom out a little bit and see changes over a longer period of time. We have historic emissions, and we also show where we currently sit. And other than the progress that we made during the coal phase out between 2005 and 2015 time period, we continue to see very little sustained progress across the region in reducing emissions. And in fact, we're officially back at 2019 emission levels. So all the reductions that we saw during the pandemic years are now effectively gone. You also very clearly see the upwards trajectory that we've been going is opposite to where we need to go to reach 2030 targets and beyond. Now, the rate of increase of emissions that I mentioned earlier is not extremely high. We're talking about 1%. And when you normalize for population, we do see some decreases. But I want to emphasize that that's not enough. We need to reach and we need to sustain that 11% decrease per year through population growth, which is something that we expect will continue across the region. Next slide, please. Looking at emissions from a sector point of view, profiles stayed pretty similar, and they have stayed like that over the last couple of years, with the building sector being the top source of emissions across the region at 45%, and that's by a fairly large margin. The next biggest source of emissions was transportation, and specifically the use of gasoline and diesel fuel. And emissions here have officially returned to pre-pandemic levels. And then we have industry, waste, and agriculture emissions, which make up the remaining portions. Each of these sectors had moderate changes in emissions. Industry saw a bit of a dip. Steel in Hamilton, cement production in Jerome Peel continued to dominate and drive those emissions. We also saw that in 2024, the percent share of industrial emissions compared to overall emissions decreased ever so slightly. Waste and agriculture have remained fairly constant over the last couple of years. And I do also want to point out that the majority of food that we consume within the GTHA is produced outside of the region. So those emissions are not reflected in the agriculture sector that we track here. Next slide. As mentioned, building emissions are the biggest portion, and they predominantly come from natural gas used for space heating, hot water, and natural gas plants used to generate electricity. Total building emissions increased by about 1.7%, while per capita building emissions decreased by roughly 3%. And there's a couple of reasons driving those trends. First, we have natural gas consumption that decreased across the region. But this progress here, the small progress that we saw here, isn't just tied to a slightly warmer winter, which we had in 2024. We actually saw that weather normalized natural gas emissions decreased by about 1%, which is a positive trend after the last couple of years of increases. Specifically, we saw reductions in natural gas consumption from commercial and residential buildings. And that's really indicating there is local progress. There's progress from building retrofits, efficiency improvements, fuel switching. All of that is starting to make an impact. We saw that consumption increase in industrial buildings, and particularly in Halton Hills, where there was close to a 20% jump, specifically in industrial building natural gas emissions. And we saw several new customers come online there. Now, aside from Halton Hills, taking into account weather impacts and population increases, most of the region saw a small reduction in natural gas consumption. And with that, I'll pass things on to Pat to discuss the electricity side.
Yeah, thanks, Katrina, and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please. So electricity emissions in the GTHA have been rising steadily over the last number of years, as you can see in this chart. And in 2024, this upward trend continued, reaching 4.5 megatons, which equates to a pretty sizable 28% increase in electricity emissions. If we look a little further back to 2020, electricity emissions have doubled since then and are expected to double again by 2030. So to understand what's behind this rising trend, we need to consider really the two main drivers behind electricity emissions. They are one, overall demand for electricity in the region. In other words, how much electricity is actually being consumed. And the second factor is the carbon intensity of the electricity generation being used to actually meet that demand. So starting with the first factor, electricity demand, we've seen that demand has been actually relatively stable over the last decade, with 2024's total demand being only about 2% higher than in 2015. So that means that the substantial and sustained increase in electricity emissions really has not been driven by, runaway electricity demand. It's really been that second factor, year over year increases in the carbon intensity of the provincial electricity grid. That's really causing electricity emissions to rise. So the carbon intensity of the grid increased, which is essentially grams of carbon emissions per kilowatt hour. So that's increased 25% in 2024, and is now over 100% higher than it was in 2020. Now, the reason the grid has become more carbon intensive in a relatively short period of time is more and more of our electricity is being produced from gas-fired generation. Our natural gas-fired peaker plants are operating far more often than just peak periods, in large part due to ongoing refurbishments to our nuclear fleet, coupled with a lack of investment in alternatives to make up that gap with resources other than gas. Now, a clean grid is critical to a decarbonized economy. So the concern here is, of course, that emissions will continue to rise if we stay on our current trajectory. Next slide, please. And to illustrate this point, we have this chart here showing both historical and forecasted emissions in Ontario. So just a note that the previous slide was showing GTHA specific numbers. Here we're looking Ontario-wide, but certainly the story and the trends are the same. So in terms of historical emissions, in the blue line on the left, emissions really bottomed out in 2017 and have been rising really ever since. In terms of the electricity emissions forecast, the yellow line on the right side of the chart, the Independent Electricity System Operator, the IESO, is projecting a 75% increase in electricity demand by 2050, with a major driver of this demand being new energy-intensive data centers for AI. So what this means is that there's a sizable demand-supply gap emerging in the 2030s. And so the ISO plans to fill the gap through a series of capacity and energy procurements over the coming years. So having said that, the ultimate supply mix will depend on the results of these procurements and any government policies, but the IESO has modeled a capacity expansion scenario as part of its 2025 annual planning outlook, which identifies the least cost supply mix required to meet Ontario's resource adequacy needs. So that's what the scenario that we see reflected in the forecasted emissions here on the chart. So as you can see, in the short term, emissions rise pretty rapidly with a doubling by 2030, followed by a general downward trend out to 2050. Now, there is considerable uncertainty in the forecast, particularly over the long term. So really, at the end of the day, to truly address the problem of rising electricity emissions, it's really imperative to limit how often our existing gas plants are operating, as well as prohibiting any new or expanded gas-fired generation capacity. And additionally, I'll just add that the forecasted 75% increase in demand by 2050 is certainly not a foregone conclusion, and there are measures that we can and should take to mitigate rises in demand, which includes things like scaling energy efficiency and conservation efforts, as well as enhancing load flexibility. Next slide, please. So switching gears a little bit, I'm just going to take a look at the transportation sector results now. So transportation emissions went up by 1% in 2024, and we're now sitting at 20.2 megatons. So this was about a quarter of the increase we saw in 2023. And while it is or may be encouraging to see the rate of increase slowing down, of course, the reality is that emissions have, in fact, gone up again when they need to be going down. In terms of mode share, as of 2022, which is the most current MTO data available, about 2/3 of total trips are in personal automobiles, which we certainly like to see decrease, particularly considering that the median trip length has decreased over the past few years. When we normalize the data for population, transportation emissions per capita actually decreased by a little over 3%, which indicates that the rise in transportation emissions was largely related to population growth. So in other words, the decreases or the reduction in per capita emissions wasn't enough to counter the rise in population. So it nets out to an increase in total emissions. So we do know population is having a direct effect on emissions, as well as the predominant use of internal combustion engine vehicles. And a growing shift towards return to office mandates also presents a challenge for reducing transportation-related emissions. And I think really speaks to the importance of having, robust alternative clean modes of transportation available for everyone. With that, next slide, please. With that, there is some good news to share in the transportation side. So 2024 saw another considerable year-over-year increase in electric vehicle registrations. So that we saw a 34% increase in battery EV registrations and a 41% increase in plug-in hybrid registrations. And this is GTHA we're talking about here. So we now have nearly 130,000 total EVs registered in the region, and municipalities like East Gwillimbury, Oakville, Caledon, and Richmond Hill have the highest number of registrations per capita amongst the municipalities. We did note that the rate of increase in EV registrations has been slowing, which really speaks to the importance of both maintaining and bolstering incentives and ensuring that both current and prospective EV owners have access to robust and convenient charging networks. Finally, we also track transit ridership across the GTHA, and we saw an overall increase of 9%. So total ridership is about 13% below 2019, the pre-pandemic total from 2019. Although several of the region's transit agencies have either rebounded or surpassed their pre-pandemic totals. There were particularly large increases in ridership on Durham Region Transit and Metrolinx, as well as Milton Transit, which actually saw a pretty incredible 73% rise in ridership in 2024. With that, I will pass the baton over to Brian to speak to some key climate action priorities.
Thank you, Pat, and good afternoon, everyone. So our inventory is mainly about the sources of emissions, trends, and what's driving changes in emissions around the region. But we also take stock of climate policy and climate policy priorities coming out of the data. And the inventory also includes a municipal climate policy tracker, which is a great tool for advocates and municipal staff to look at what key policies are in place in which municipalities across the region. And we encourage you to take a look and also let us know if we're missing anything. Next slide, please. So starting with the municipal level of government, cities have a key role to play in addressing climate change and mitigating emissions. Starting with the building sector, one of the most important priorities we've highlighted for a number of years is standards for new construction, green development standards, which have been really instrumental in helping reduce growth in building emissions. It's a rapidly growing region. We saw 300,000 people added to the region last year. And trying to reduce building sector emissions while we're building so many new buildings, primarily heated with fossil fuels, is kind of like running on a treadmill. You can work really hard and not actually make any progress. Just to stay in the same place, you're working up a sweat. So many cities across the region have green development standards in place. There's some uncertainty right now because of a number of provincial measures restricting municipal authorities in the planning process and specifically around certain elements of green development standards. Although for the moment, many cities are continuing to move forward with their green development standards. So some uncertainty here. We encourage municipalities to maintain their standards if they feel they're able to. Obviously, every city's got to come to its own determination, but there's a sound case for the legal authorities, and to also, though, prudently prepare contingency plans. So we know that there's ongoing policy deliberations at the province, which might affect municipal authorities in this area. And so municipalities should also be thinking about contingency plans of other ways to address emissions, ways to strengthen incentives for voluntary compliance, for example, so that they're prepared in the eventuality of further provincial policy changes that might restrict their abilities to move forward on green standards. And then existing buildings, of course, is the next step. The City of Toronto has been working closely, developing a potential building emissions performance standard for existing buildings, setting requirements for emissions reductions or emissions intensity for large buildings. That's something we're encouraging other cities to look at, and also an enabling policy that cities can start with to help streamline that down the road is energy and water reporting and benchmarking. Also, the city has Toronto has a bylaw there that can be a model for others to improve upon. And it really enables future policy options. It's a good step in itself to drive emissions downward, create information that helps you target supports and funding programs for the worst performing buildings. But it also opens up the option in the future for these emissions performance standards for those cities that are prepared to go there. Another priority we're really encouraging cities to look at is to look at zoning and permitting type issues that create unintended barriers to climate action. We're seeing a lot of these mostly unintended in zoning bylaws, for example, around the region. We've published some resources on that. And these are barriers to things like solar storage, heat pumps, and often when we track down, there's no real awareness of what the cause of some of these barriers were, mostly unintended. So really encouraging everyone to review all of those types of zoning bylaws and other permitting type processes to enable climate action as much as possible. And on the transportation front, cities have a key role in enabling and accelerating electric vehicle charging. That's both through looking at requirements for it in new construction, such as requiring new residential construction to be EV ready, rough-in requirements. Also looking at how they can use their own facilities for public charging and enable faster adoption in the rest of the community. Charging access is still a key barrier for wider adoption of electric vehicles, and so we encourage cities to tackle that. And of course, looking at continuing to grow transit use, decarbonize public transportation, and support active transportation as well. Next slide. Moving on to the provincial level of government. We talked a lot about electricity, and that's been one of the the biggest factor this year driving emissions upward. And in fact, emissions would have fallen slightly this year if not for the large increase in electricity generation emissions. So, I mean, the number one thing is to prioritize development of clean electricity to meet our electricity generation and capacity needs. Whether, going back to previous commitments to only procure and build new non-emitting generation, or at least to take emissions into account in the procurement process. Right now, there's no consideration of emissions in procurement of new electricity resources, and we think that's an oversight. And of course, continuing or pursuing all cost-effective demand-side measures. That's energy efficiency, but also distributed energy resources. Some great investments coming through the new electricity demand-side management framework at the province, but there's room for growth there, even within the budgeted amounts. And there's lots of provincial red tape issues that restrict ability to implement distributed energy resources that the province can clean up. On the building side, working more closely with municipalities to enable green development and to modernize the building code, harmonize with the energy and carbon requirements in the national code would go a long way towards both creating more consistency and addressing emissions from buildings. On transportation, electric vehicle supports are key. We've seen some funding from the province for charging, but it's been just annual allocations, which are quickly exhausted, showing there's much more demand from the sector for financial support to install electric vehicle charging. And the province could also be looking at other tools such as vehicle rebates, which several provinces have, or supporting medium and heavy duty electrification. And then finally, it's important that the province have a climate plan and climate targets. The province has proposed and announced its intent to formally rescind its climate plan and its climate targets, which will leave Ontario with no plan and no targets and no reporting mechanism. And this is just a basic step. We would encourage all governments to have a plan, have targets, report against it. And that's really key for accountability. It's key for signaling industry where the province is going. And it's really essential for making progress. Next slide. On to the federal government. The federal government also has a role in the electricity sector. It has a clean electricity regulation that's been put in place and is being reviewed right now. Some potential tweaks there. We encourage them to look at how to strengthen that, make it more effective. and put the financial supports in place to enable provinces to meet and exceed the clean electricity regulation requirements. We have a new clean electricity investment tax credit that's long promised and now being promised again for before the end of the year, encouraging the feds to put that in place and look at other funding mechanisms to support provinces and utilities in advancing clean energy and building out the interprovincial transmission grid that will enable more cost-effective decarbonization. On the transportation front, there's a key federal role. The federal government has put out a EV availability standard regulation requiring transition and sales towards electric vehicles. But it has recently put that on pause for a year, delayed the start of that for a year, and is reviewing further changes, which could negatively impact that regulation. And so we're encouraging the federal government to restore the EV availability standard, maintain its stringency, and put in place enabling policies around that, including restoring electric vehicle rebates and charging infrastructure funding. The expiration of federal rebates earlier this year was really the key driver of the most recent market downturn and vehicle adoption. And really, it's essential that we have predictable supports for consumers to adopt these vehicles that will enable growth and predictable regulations which stimulate industry and to invest in our EV charging network. And onto the building sector, the federal government's been actively looking at updating the national codes. There's a new code update, the 2025 codes, expected to be published this year, which will bring in carbon emissions requirement. Embodied carbon requirements are on the way for a future code update, and really encouraging the federal government to continue moving forward on the model codes and create clear pathways for dropping the lower tiers and a sort of transitioning the national model code to a net zero ready type code. Also, through its growing investment in the housing sector through Build Canada Homes, there's a real opportunity to make sure that's done in a way that is prioritizing low carbon emissions, both operational and embodied, and to create clear standards for that. So as we're helping to build up, the federal government's really working to build up a new and emerging industry around prefabricated housing supply and components. And as we're setting that up, if we want it to be successful, we should really be setting it up to meet the needs of tomorrow, which means being designed to meet what will be the codes that will be in place across the country by 2030, being designed to enable net zero ready buildings. And there's great potential for prefabrication to support that, but it needs to be built into this growing industry from the beginning. And next slide, please. And that concludes the policy review, and I'm going to turn it back over to Julie to set up our Q&A.
Thank you, Brian, and thanks to all of the presenters for sharing your insights. We are going to move on to discussion, and we have questions from registration and from the Q&A. You can now add more questions to the Q&A below. Feel free to upvote others. The first question is for Brian, and it's a bit of a big picture question. With emissions rising again and many proven solutions that we know still on the table, from technology available to a willing workforce, it's becoming clear that we're lacking political leadership and scale, pace and scale to implement these carbon reductions opportunity. And that's probably leaving many of us on the call discouraged. So what can you tell us about where to focus and what's next?
Well, I would agree. Political leadership and policy certainty are definitely the missing ingredients right now to accelerate climate action and get emissions moving in the right direction. We're seeing some encouraging signs among consumers and businesses of an appetite for climate action. We've seen key funding programs expire early because of higher than expected enrollment. Things like the Greener Homes Grant, the Greener Homes Loan, the electric vehicle rebates, all ended early because of higher than expected participation, which shows that there's a pent-up demand for climate action. And we've seen something similar in many industry or business-facing programs where these have run out of money and not been renewed. And so this is really showing that businesses and industry are ready to move forward, as well as consumers ready to move forward with climate action. They need that policy support and certainty to accelerate it and enable it. And right now, the lack of that is deterring investment and deterring change. We seem to be back to a political environment where climate action is really seen as a competing priority with economic growth, affordability, housing. And we need to kind of take another look at redoubling our efforts really to position climate action as not a competing priority, but an enabler for other objectives like affordability through fuel savings and energy cost savings, like economic growth through green jobs, and like helping to solve our housing challenges through modernized high performance construction. That's something we've tried many times in the past, and I think we need to take a closer look at how we really tune up that messaging. And also, we need to provide clear advice to policymakers and decision makers on, what the current trajectory is for emissions and what it will really take to bend the emissions curve downward. We need to make sure if we are going to miss our targets, that the policy decision makers are crystal clear on like what actions they could take to get us back on the path. And we find this low awareness among policy decision makers, but even that we're not on track for our climate targets or of, which actions will actually be helpful in advancing that. And so we need to avoid sort of low impact actions that allow people to feel like we're making progress but don't move the dial, and really kind of create a strategic focus on the important policies and programs and investments we know will have a really material impact.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. And one of the priorities you mentioned earlier was building retrofits. We focus a lot on buildings at TAF. It's the largest source of urban emissions in the region. The next question came through registration. It's for Ekaterina. Are building retrofits actually making a dent in building emissions? So we want to know, we've put a lot of focus on retrofits and retrofit policy in the past. Do we have proof in the data that's showing, emissions are having an impact? And also if you could let us know if we have similar data for new building construction, so green standards, are those making a dent in emissions?
Thanks, Julie. I'll attempt to answer it kind of in two parts. Maybe starting with new buildings first. The answer is absolutely. We can see, green development standards are making an impact, and historically there's been a proof in that. I think one of the best examples is with the Toronto Green Standards. We looked at historic performance. They've been around for quite a while, and we saw, between 2010 and 2024, so roughly a 15-year period, Toronto Green Standards helped save almost 1 million tons of carbon. You're looking at that's equivalent to about 300,000 cars off the road, and that's about over $400 million in total utility savings just during that 15-year time frame. There's also, a lot of other co-benefits that come hand in hand with the carbon and the energy reductions when you're building high performance new construction. You're building resilient buildings, you're building comfortable buildings, buildings that are healthy for their occupants, for the people that work and live in those buildings. And you're also ensuring that these buildings don't need to be retrofitted or they don't come into all sorts of operational issues, soon after they're constructed. So our research has also shown with new versions and more robust metrics of green development standards, that directly translates into improvements in energy and carbon performance. We're also getting better at predicting the performance of these types of buildings. Looking at those effects, as well as the effects of retrofits of existing buildings, which are happening. Brian mentioned a number of policies that oftentimes get oversubscribed. We are starting to see that translate into the inventory. I talked about, weather normalized natural gas. So taking the weather component out of it, the weather variable out of it, we saw reductions by a couple of percent across the region, which was really important to see, and especially in commercial and residential buildings. So we're seeing there's proof in the pudding, so to speak. We're seeing those reductions. We're seeing those improvements. We just need to do more of that. And I think this really emphasizes that these types of policies can work. We've seen progress historically, and we certainly cannot reverse the efforts that many leading municipalities are taking.
Great. Thanks, Ekaterina. And now a question about the inventory itself and how we look at emissions. This question from Amelia for you, Ekaterina. Does the inventory split urban and rural to see the difference in emissions? Can you tell us a bit about that split?
So we are seeing some differences, largely in transportation, between the urban and rural. Oftentimes, if there's a greater reliance on personal vehicle use, we tend to see some spikes in transportation and some increases in transportation year to year. Also, we do see differences depending on building types. That kind of translates into the electricity and natural gas. In terms of our downloadable data, that's part of the website. Amelia, you can go into that, and for each region and for each municipality within the regions across the GTHA, we break down consumption across different sectors. And so you can certainly look at comparisons that way. If it is of interest to maybe see more of summary charts, we can absolutely take that into account for future iterations and maybe make that sort of back end information a little bit more visible. So if that's of interest, please get in touch and let us know.
Great. And I guess while we're on buildings, I'm going to keep it going on retrofits and heat pumps. This is a great question from Elizabeth, and I'll put this to you, Brian, about the cost of heat pumps and the business case for installing heat pumps. Elizabeth is asking about the home renovation savings program, which says you won't necessarily save on costs by installing a heat pump. Do we have energy cost comparison that considers ultra low pricing? Her personal calculation shows that most of their heat is used during the cheapest period, but I'm wondering if you could just break down a little bit the costs and how else maybe you could find savings to make that heat pump work for a residential scenario.
Right. So we don't have any published research on this, although it's something we're looking at and have started to take a look at. Certainly, I think the prompt for the question is really how related to how the elimination of the consumer carbon price did really negatively impact the savings potential from heat pumps in various scenarios, including in single family homes. Whereas there was a strong, potential to save on energy costs with an effective heat pump installation prior to that. The picture is much murkier now, and depending on your electricity rate plan, depending on the system characteristics and your home characteristics, the heat pump may or may not generate energy savings, and it's hard to model. We do agree that the ultra low overnight rate plan for those on it would probably be the best for other things being equal for heat pump economics and can help to enable net savings. Other factors that could help with that, include if you have some sort of hybrid system with retaining the gas system, then programming that to prioritize the heat pump off peak is another way to achieve savings, operational savings. And otherwise, just really working with your contractor and designer to make sure you have a highly efficient heat pump. So heat pumps can really range in their operating efficiency based on both the quality of the product and the quality of the design and installation and controls. So really working to optimize that can go a long way to generating net savings, as well as making other simple improvements in the home like weatherization that can also help with the net savings. So that's the best I could do to answer that question. But yeah, it's certainly a concern that with carbon pricing gone, that's a harder business case to make for heating electrification.
There may be some tools we've had shared with us that to do some calculations on residential, and we can share those with you as follow-up if we can track those down. This question For Katrina, it's follow on because Brian mentioned the importance of the contractors, and of course, we need to rely on contractors being, educated and aware and experts on heat pumps now. So this question came from Elizabeth. How can we help HVAC contractors gain confidence to propose heat pumps and not just quote replacement gas furnaces?
I think this is a really important question. So thank you for that. When you look at the contractors, oftentimes they're the parties that are directly in contact with the end consumer that is deciding between, do I go with something that is already in my building, maybe that I'm comfortable, that I'm familiar with, that I know how it works, versus a new technology or putting something new in my home. So they're really a critical group to ensure that we can accelerate the installation of this type of equipment, meaning heat pumps. So ensuring that they're trained, that they're confident in the installations, that they're knowledgeable about how these pieces of equipment operate. That I think is absolutely key, and that is going to be really important in just ensuring we're not always defaulting to replacing like for like, right? Replacing your gas furnace for another gas furnace. And so that sort of training coordination is going to be really important in training materials, training curriculum for HVAC contractors and installers, ensuring they're going after certification, and ultimately they're familiar and confident in the systems that they're working on and that they're installing. The other sort of aspect I wanted to just highlight, and this is a nod to one of our policy recommendations that Brian talked about, removing sort of the barriers when we're talking about permitting, when we're talking about installations of heat pumps and things like that. I think that's another important side to make it easy to install these en masse. And that's what really the inventory showed us in 2024. We need to do more of this type of improvement, this type of actions, and we need to do it across the entire region.
Thank you. And shifting gears a little bit to transportation, we had a question through the registration. This one's for you, Patrick. What's going on with transportation emissions? Have they fully rebounded to pre-pandemic? Or is fuel cost and remote working and EVs impacting the trend? So just a little high level on transportation there.
Sure. Thanks, Julie. So prior to 2019 or prior to 2020, I should say, transportation emissions were increasing year over year. The increases were roughly 200,000 tons, 0.2 megatons. Of course, in 2020, we saw a pretty dramatic decline in emissions, about 20%, of course, due to the pandemic. And since then, we've seen rises every year. Once again, the increases have ranged from 9% down to 1%, which is what we saw this year. So to answer the question, I would say yes, emissions have rebounded to pre-pandemic levels. We're, I think, within plus or minus 2% of that 2019 total. So we are back to that level. I think all three of those factors that were mentioned, fuel costs, remote work, EVs, are certainly all going to impact transport emissions. I think a big driver that we saw this year certainly was population growth. And I guess on that note, I think I mentioned it, but return to office policies are going to start or have and will continue to make it more challenging to reduce emissions. So really just speaking to the importance of building out infrastructure, enhancing public transit, many of the things that Brian highlighted, really to give commuters alternative options, that don't necessarily involve driving personal internal combustion engine vehicles. So yeah, takeaway, I would say we've bounced back to that pre-pandemic total, unfortunately.
And Pat, we also had a question about airports in the region. We didn't used to report on Scope 3 aviation emissions, and we now do. Could you comment a little bit about what we're seeing there?
Yeah, for sure. And I'm glad we got that question because we weren't able to cover it in the presentation, but we do quantify Scope 3 aviation emissions from Toronto Pearson and from Billy Bishop Airport in Toronto. So at Pearson, emissions rose in 2024 by about 5%. And so the total there is about 7.5 megatons. At Billy Bishop, it's obviously a much smaller airport. Emissions actually decreased around 18%. And the total at Billy Bishop is around 64 kilotons. So combined, it nets out to an increase of 4% in GTHA emissions across the GTHA. Um, I guess I'll just point out as well that, emissions bottomed out in 2021 as a result of the pandemic. Since then, they've more than tripled, and we're now about 93% back to the pre-pandemic air travel. And I guess from a methodology standpoint, I'll just point out that we base our aviation emissions analysis on jet fuel usage. We unfortunately do not include the John C. Munro Airport in Hamilton and some other smaller private airports just due to a lack of publicly available data. But certainly Pearson is by and large the big one in the region. So we've captured that in the inventory online and in our downloadable data sets. So I would encourage you to check that out.
Excellent. Thanks, Pat. And I love seeing our attendees helping each other out in the chat. We have Toronto Hydro helping out a condo owner with some info on incentives. So thank you for that, Michael. And another note that TAF also has resources to support condo owners through their retrofits. We have a retrofit accelerator program that supports multifamily building owners. So social housing, co-ops, condos, apartments. So you can contact us about that too. And thanks for those notes in the chat coming in. Moving on to electricity system, there's a great question from Lynn here. We made reference in the presentation to the impact of gas-fired electricity generation. Do we have any data? And I think I'll pose this to Brian, or if you have the info, Pat, data related to specific plants. So the recently published IRRP report from IESO, that's the Independent Electricity System Operator, focuses on third transmission line from Darlington. Quite possibly Portland's will have to ramp up to deliver on that a line. So, we have a long period of time to wait until SMRs and new nuclear will be up and running. So in the short term, do we have that sort of more granular data on gas plants?
So I can say that we do have the data on gas. It is publicly available by gas plant. Some of the team could speak more knowledgeably about that, perhaps. But certainly we've seen the Portland's Energy Center, which the question references, see much more intensive use in recent years. It was originally brought in to be a peaking plant, but it was close to 24/7 type operation for a number of years now. And and so we expect that to continue for the near future. And certainly that's one of the things that we've been looking at with the city, and that the RRP, the regional plan ISO has worked on, looks at opportunities to reduce use of Portland's. But yeah, I'll throw it to the team if we have offhand more specific data, or if that's included in our downloads.
We don't, thanks, Brian. We don't have specific data on that in our downloadable file. We didn't do an analysis at that level per se, but it's certainly a good question, and something that we can definitely consider looking into for our next inventory.
We also have just, Miriam, go ahead. I was just going to say, Miriam just put in a note with a link for more information on some of the individual gas plants.
So I love this question from someone in the group. Where do the geothermal systems fit into this mix? So Brian, a few large condo projects are going to employ, or going to employ them in Toronto. We're hearing a lot about data centers and geothermal. Can they be used to greater effect and reduce demand on the electrical grid?
So the short answer is yes. So a good question. We've seen in the last few years actually a dramatic increase in market share for geothermal or ground source heat exchange particularly in new construction. From our conversations with the industry, that's been a big factor in that has been green development standards, first in Toronto and now increasingly around the region. The industry has found ground source heat exchange or geothermal a very effective technology for cost effectively meeting those requirements. It's pretty well, outside of some exotic systems, like one of the most efficient HVAC systems you can get. It gets buildings off of fossil fuels, but it also, compared to an air source heat pump, it's about half the peak demand, so it's much easier for the grid to manage. So there's multiple advantages, and its growth has been enabled by the development of geothermal as a utility type offerings from various companies in the region that will own, operate, and finance or various combinations of these systems for new developments, so that it actually becomes more cost effective for developers because that's structured through a long-term operating agreement rather than like a utility service, rather than something they have to pay for, right? And so, yeah, latest data we were seeing was, a very significant share of large new buildings in Toronto that are under construction or under getting ready for construction right now include geothermal, something around, don't quote me exactly, but around a third of those projects have a geothermal component. So that's huge compared to a few years ago where it was really unusual to see that in new buildings. So a great technology and a good example of how policy is driving innovation and technology growth into the market.
Great, and we have a couple minutes left, so I'm going to put this as a last question. Stephen is asking, is there any hope for the province to support renewables anytime soon versus nukes requiring US-made inputs? I don't think we can speak on behalf of the province, certainly, or have a crystal ball, but I think there are areas that we can really emphasize that maybe do align with the province of Ontario's priorities. So maybe Brian could speak to that, just some of our work on provincial policy advocacy and maybe some of the key points of influence and levers upcoming on that Ontario front.
Right. So I will say I expect we're going to see some renewable energy projects moving forward. It's been a long time since any utility scale renewables were built in Ontario, but the current procurement, long-term procurement too, that's underway, and we'll have several rounds in coming years. We're expecting to see that. We're expecting to see that procurement result in new renewables, among other technologies. While the province has eliminated any consideration of greenhouse gas emissions from their procurement process, they've really oriented most of it as around cost effectiveness, and renewables really stand out there. They've fallen in price so much that they've become the most cost effective source of new generation. And so we expect to see some, and there've been some proposals come forward in the GTA already for large urban solar projects, and we expect to see more as well as more battery storage. And that's a key point for advocacy as well with the province to make sure that these procurements are structured to recognize the benefits of clean energy, to avoid unintended barriers for those technologies. And to address red tape issues, longstanding issues, I mean, the most notable is the moratorium on offshore wind. It's not really science-based in Ontario. There's not really any evidence or rationale behind it, so that's something that could be gotten rid of. But there's also undue restrictions on solar energy as well within provincial regulations. We've identified. We can itemize those on request, and so it's a key message for the province to. And also, local communities can play a role because the province is committed that municipalities need to endorse any new energy infrastructure within their territory. And so, if there are natural gas plant or expanded plants proposed, municipalities can have the right to say no to that. And if there are renewable energy or energy storage projects coming forward, municipalities likewise can endorse those and increase their chances of being selected by the IESO. So cities have a key role to play here through their approval authority over what gets built in their territory.
Great, and I'll cut you off there because we are wrapping up the webinar, but we'd be remiss not to mention solar. A couple questions came in that were answered in writing, and then another question from Jonathan. It's a great question. Solar panels, they're now the cheapest way to generate electricity in Ontario. So why aren't we seeing more of them? We could have a whole webinar on this. So I'm just going to say stay tuned. We have a lot to say about that in terms of the regulatory barriers, in terms of the incentives needed. I think we're absolutely underestimating the potential for rooftop solar in Ontario, and we're going to see more of that to come. TAF will certainly be in touch about that soon. Teaser for a new program coming up. In the meantime, we are out of time. Thank you so much for joining us today, for your amazing and encouraging comments in the chat. Thanks for your hard work on carbon reduction. And as usual, please send us your feedback. We'd love to hear your feedback on the report itself. Today's webinar. We're here to support your climate plans, so inquire about our grants program or request a briefing with our policy team to get specialized advice for your region. That's it for today. Thanks to our panelists and attendees. Have a great day, everyone.